Grown men aren't killed by 12-year-old girls. Experienced overseers aren't outsmarted by them. Deaths so precise that entire communities mistake murder for misfortune aren't orchestrated by children. Yet across 3 cotton plantations in Burke County, Georgia, 17 men died under circumstances no one could explain. Beginning in late March of 1851, the deaths continued for nearly 4 years. Every victim had one thing in common: power over the enslaved. Nothing suspicious was found by medical examiners. Accidents, disease, and bad luck were blamed by plantation owners. Every investigation was closed within days by the local sheriff. What was never discovered was that 2 identical faces watched each death unfold with eyes that held no fear, no guilt, and absolutely no mercy. Before we continue with this story from Burke County, I need you to do something for me. If you're enjoying this dark piece of American history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so stories like this never pass you by. I'm also curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let me tell you about Sarah and Margaret Hutchkins and the 4 years that changed everything in Burke County. The spring of 1851 found Burke County in the midst of its most profitable cotton season in a decade. Locally known as Hutchkins Fields, the Hutchkins plantation sprawled across 800 acres of prime Georgia soil approximately 12 miles south of Wesboro. That land was lived and worked by 347 souls, their lives governed by rhythms older than memory: dawn bells, cotton rows stretching to horizons, the crack of leather on human skin. The property had been inherited by William Hutchkins from his father in 1843, and under his management, production had doubled. Throughout the county, he was known as a shrewd businessman, a church deacon, and a man who kept meticulous records. Every bale of cotton, every birth, every death, every dollar spent, all was documented in leather-bound ledgers filling an entire wall of his study. With similar precision, his wife, Elenina, managed the household, overseeing the domestic workforce with a coldness that required no raised voice. In January of 1851, the Hutchkins had purchased Sarah and Margaret from a trader passing through Augusta. The bill of sale listed the girls as twin females, approximately 12 years of age, both in good health, trained for domestic service. No surname was recorded. No parents were mentioned. On a Tuesday afternoon, they arrived at Hutchkins Fields, riding in the back of a wagon with 7 other newly purchased individuals, their identical faces betraying no emotion as they surveyed their new home. With the efficiency of long practice, the head overseer, a man named Robert Thaddeus Crane, processed the arrivals. For 6 years, Crane had worked at Hutchkins Fields, earning a reputation as a man who maintained discipline without excessive brutality, a distinction that mattered in that time and place. He was 42 years old, built like an oak barrel, with hands that could snap a shovel handle and a voice that carried across 20 acres. To work under the supervision of his wife Martha, who managed the kitchen and laundry, he assigned Sarah and Margaret. In those early weeks, what no one noticed was how the twins watched everything, not with the frightened furtiveness of new arrivals, but with a focused intensity that absorbed every detail. They noted which overseers rode which routes at which times. The hierarchy among the enslaved population was observed by them: who held influence, who harbored grudges, who could be trusted with a secret. With the precision of military strategists, they studied the physical layout of the plantation, learning every building, every path, every place where someone might be alone. Initially, Martha Crane found the girls unsettling. "They don't speak unless spoken to," she mentioned to her husband one evening in March, "and when they look at you, it's like they're counting something behind their eyes." Her concerns were dismissed by Robert. Silent obedience, he reminded her, was preferable to the alternative. In perfect synchronization, the twins worked. When one carried water, the other anticipated exactly when she would need assistance. Without words, they seemed to communicate, a glance sufficient to coordinate complex tasks. That Sarah and Margaret never made mistakes, not small ones, not large ones, began to be noticed by the other women in the kitchen. Every instruction was followed precisely, every duty completed exactly as specified. This perfection made them nearly invisible, servants so reliable that adults stopped paying attention to their presence. By late March, less than 3 months had been spent by the twins at Hutchkins Fields. They knew the name of every overseer and field supervisor. They understood the daily patterns of each one. The storage locations of tools, the maintenance schedules for equipment, the routes traveled by men who worked alone, all had been identified by them. And with special attention, they had begun to watch one particular individual, a man named Vernon Cushing, who served as overseer for the East Cotton Fields. Vernon Cushing was 28 years old, unmarried, and known throughout Burke County for his cruelty. Where other overseers maintained discipline through intimidation and occasional punishment, Cushing seemed to derive pleasure from causing pain. He was particularly brutal toward women and children, a fact that Robert Crane had cautioned him about more than once. But Cushing was effective at maintaining production quotas, and William Hutchkins valued results above methods. For 3 weeks, the twins had watched Cushing before they made their decision. With scientific precision, they observed his habits. Every morning, he rode his horse along a narrow path through a stand of pine trees bordering the eastern fields. Connecting the slave quarters to the work areas, the path cut through terrain that grew muddy after rain. Always alone, always at the same time, approximately 15 minutes after the dawn bell, when most of the enslaved population had already moved to their workstations, Cushing always rode this path. On the morning of March 28, 1851, conditions were perfect. Heavy rain had fallen throughout the previous night, turning the pine path into a treacherous mixture of red clay and standing water. Before dawn, the twins rose, slipping from the kitchen quarters while darkness still covered the plantation. Nothing but a short piece of rope taken from the stable 3 days earlier was carried by them. What happened next took less than 5 minutes. A spot where the path narrowed between 2 large pines had been selected by the twins, a place where recent rains had created a depression collecting several inches of water. Across the path at precisely the right height, they strung the rope, low enough to catch a horse's front legs, high enough to be invisible in the pre-dawn darkness and muddy water. Then they retreated to a position 20 yards distant and waited. At his usual time, Vernon Cushing rode through. At full trot, his horse hit the rope. The animal's front legs tangled, and physics took over. Hard went down the horse, throwing Cushing forward. Face first in the muddy depression, he landed, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Panicking, the horse rolled partially over its rider in the struggle to regain footing. By the time other workers found Cushing, he had drowned in 8 inches of muddy water, his nose and mouth clogged with Georgia clay. Already, the twins had retrieved their rope and returned to the kitchen before anyone noticed Cushing's absence. They were preparing breakfast when the shouting began, when men ran toward the pine path, when Robert Crane himself galloped past the kitchen house. Without pause, Sarah and Margaret continued their work, their identical faces showing nothing but mild curiosity when Martha rushed in with the news. "Vernon Cushing is dead," Martha announced, her voice shaking. "His horse threw him in the mud down by the east path. Drowned in a puddle, they're saying." Can you imagine a grown man drowned in a puddle? Sympathetically, the twins nodded and returned to kneading dough for the morning bread. Within hours, the investigation, such as it was, concluded. From Westboro, the sheriff rode out, examined the scene, and determined that tragic accidents happened on muddy paths. Clearly, the horse had lost footing in the treacherous conditions. Misadventure was ruled as Cushing's death. 2 days later, he was buried in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church in Westboro, and life at Hutchkins Fields continued without interruption. But something had changed, though it was recognized by only 2 people. That careful planning could produce results appearing completely natural had been discovered by Sarah and Margaret. They had learned that adults, when presented with a plausible accident, would accept it without question. And they had identified 16 more names on their list. A temporary void in the overseer hierarchy at Hutchkins Fields was created by the death of Vernon Cushing. To fill the position, William Hutchkins promoted one of the field supervisors, a man named Douglas Pritchard. Pritchard was 40 years old, a Georgia native who had worked in plantation management since his 20s. A wife and 3 children living in Westboro were had by him, and he was known as a competent but unremarkable overseer, neither exceptionally cruel nor particularly lenient. For 2 weeks, the twins watched Pritchard before adding him to their list. What sealed his fate was an incident on April 16 when they witnessed him strike an elderly man named Samuel for moving too slowly during cotton loading. By the standards of that time and place, the blow itself was not unusual, but Pritchard had used a shovel handle, and Samuel had been sick with fever. The old man collapsed and didn't rise for several minutes. Twice, Pritchard kicked him before walking away. That afternoon, Sarah and Margaret made their decision. Douglas Pritchard would be the second name. Differing from Cushing's, Pritchard's routine saw him living in Westboro and riding to Hutchkins Fields each morning, arriving around 6 o'clock. At the plantation, his horse was stabled overnight, fed and prepared by an enslaved stable hand named Jacob. In the stable's tack room, Pritchard stored his saddle and riding equipment, where various pieces of leather gear and metal hardware hung from wooden pegs. Because they carried kitchen scraps for the pigs housed in a pen adjacent to the building, the twins had access to the stable area. Over the course of several days, they studied the tack room's contents and Pritchard's equipment. Well-maintained leather was his saddle, solid iron his stirrups, his girth strap secured with a standard buckle. Everything appeared normal because everything was normal, until the twins made a small modification. On the evening of April 29th, while Jacob was occupied with feeding duties and the stable area stood empty, Sarah and Margaret slipped into the tack room. What they did took less than 2 minutes. Using a piece of broken glass Sarah had carefully sharpened on a stone, they made a series of shallow cuts on the underside of Pritchard's girth strap, the leather band that secured the saddle to the horse. Precise were the cuts, invisible from casual inspection, but strategically placed to create weakness in the leather. All the way through, they didn't cut, that would have been obvious. Instead, just enough to create failure under the right conditions, specifically under the stress of a rider mounting a horse or during vigorous riding, they compromised the strap's integrity. Initially, the weakened strap would hold, but under repeated stress, it would tear gradually. Without incident, Douglas Pritchard rode to Hutchkins Fields on the morning of April 30th, secure felt his saddle, firm held his girth strap. His morning inspection of the East Fields was conducted by him, riding at a steady pace across relatively level ground. Everything seemed normal because nothing was wrong yet. Under stress, leather degradation is a gradual process. Around mid-morning, the strap began to fail. Between cotton rows, Pritchard was riding when his horse startled at a snake. Sideways jumped the animal, then began to run. An experienced horseman, Pritchard maintained control initially, but the sudden movement and the horse's speed created intense stress on the already compromised girth strap. With a sound like ripping cloth, the leather tore. Sideways rotated the saddle, and hard onto packed Georgia earth fell Pritchard. In the stirrup, his left foot remained caught. Approximately 40 yards, the panicked horse dragged him before several field workers managed to catch the animal and free the trapped overseer. A fractured skull, multiple broken ribs, and severe abrasions across his back and shoulders were suffered by Douglas Pritchard. 3 hours later in the plantation's infirmary, he died, never regaining consciousness. The death was attributed to injuries sustained from the fall and subsequent dragging by the doctor who examined him, a man named Harrison Pierce from Westboro. As the cause of the accident, the failed girth strap was noted. Himself, William Hutchkins examined the broken leather. Old equipment, he concluded, wear and tear. In his ledger, he made a note to inspect all riding gear for similar deterioration. The strap itself was discarded. For the pattern of cuts that had initiated its failure, no one thought to examine it closely. While serving lunch in the main house, Sarah and Margaret learned of Pritchard's death. In their presence, Elenina Hutchkins mentioned it to her husband, discussing the need to find another replacement overseer. Appropriate expressions of surprise were maintained by the twins, and without interruption, they continued serving food. That night, lying in their shared sleeping space in the kitchen quarters, a single word was whispered by Sarah to her sister, 3. Margaret understood. 2 men who held power over others through violence had been eliminated by them, but 15 more names were contained on their list, and they had just refined their methodology. The pattern had been established: make deaths appear accidental, use methods requiring minimal intervention, strike when opportunities presented themselves, leave no evidence that couldn't be explained by natural causes or simple misfortune. Most importantly, remain invisible, the perfect servants, the silent twins, the girls no one really noticed. The context of plantation life in 1851 Georgia was what made their campaign particularly effective. Death was common. With regularity, accidents happened. Medical knowledge was limited, and beyond surface-level examination, investigations into the deaths of overseers rarely extended. Something that would serve them well in a world where tragedy was expected had been intuited by the twins. Additional tragedy would not seem suspicious. But something else had also been learned by them from Douglas Pritchard's death. No grief had been shown by the other enslaved workers at Hutchkins Fields when the overseer died. When they thought no one could hear, several had whispered prayers of thanks. A form of justice that others desired but couldn't pursue themselves was what the twins realized they were enacting. Their next decisions were shaped by this realization. Careful attention began to be paid by them to the experiences of others. They noted which overseers inflicted the most severe punishments. They observed which supervisors showed gratuitous cruelty beyond what was required to maintain discipline. About past abuses, stored grudges, and remembered suffering, they listened to whispered conversations. More than random targets became their list of names. Someone who had earned their position through specific actions was represented by each name. And Sarah and Margaret took their time, never rushing, always waiting for the perfect opportunity to present itself. Quietly at Hutchkins Fields, May passed. A new overseer named Thomas Crawford, a man from South Carolina with 20 years of plantation experience, was hired by William Hutchkins. Competent and, by the standards of the time, relatively restrained in his disciplinary methods, Crawford proved. He was watched by the twins, but no moves were made by them. A place on their list had not yet been earned by Crawford. During this period, the twins were noticed by Robert Crane, the head overseer, not because they did anything wrong, but because they did everything right. They were 12 years old and worked with the efficiency of adults. They never complained, never showed fatigue, never made errors. In the context of plantation life, this perfection should have been remarkable, but it simply made them valuable property. To William Hutchkins, Crane mentioned that the twin girls were proving to be excellent acquisitions. What Crane didn't mention, because he didn't notice, was that the twins had begun leaving the kitchen quarters at night. Not every night, and never for long periods, but once or twice a week, Sarah and Margaret would slip out after the evening meal service ended and darkness covered the plantation grounds. Through shadows like they had been born to it, they moved, visiting locations identified during daylight hours, studying equipment and structures, planning future accidents. In ways that seemed impossible for children their age, they were methodical. They understood leverage and weight distribution. They recognized structural weaknesses in buildings and equipment. With a clarity that suggested either unusual intelligence or extensive prior experience, they intuited the relationship between cause and effect, though nothing would have been suspected by anyone who looked at their documented history. Only that they had been trained for domestic service was noted by the bill of sale that brought them to Hutchkins Fields. Where this training had occurred or what experiences had shaped them before January 1851 was not mentioned. Beyond what appeared in the documentation, no information was provided by the trader who sold them to William Hutchkins, who had purchased them at an estate auction in Augusta. About their past, Sarah and Margaret themselves never spoke, and no one thought to ask 12-year-old enslaved girls about their previous lives. But something had formed them. Something had taught them to watch, to calculate, to wait for opportunities, and to act without hesitation when those opportunities arrived. Whether this education had come from observation, instruction, or pure survival instinct, the result was the same: two 12-year-old girls who killed adults with the precision of experienced executioners. On June 14, 1851, they claimed their third victim. Harold Simmons was his name, and he served as supervisor for the cotton gin operation. Simmons was 34 years old, known throughout Burke County for his efficiency in processing cotton and his violence toward anyone who damaged equipment or slowed production. During his 3 years at Hutchkins Fields, he had personally whipped at least 24 individuals, several of whom still bore visible scars. A large wooden structure housing the mechanical equipment used to separate cotton fibers from seeds was the cotton gin building. By a horse-driven external wheel system with leather belts and wooden gears transmitting power to the processing mechanisms, the machinery was powered. Storage for processed cotton awaiting transport to the markets in Augusta and Savannah was also housed in the building. Most of his working hours inside this building were spent by Harold Simmons, supervising the feeding of raw cotton into the machinery and the collection of processed fibers. A hands-on supervisor was he, frequently adjusting equipment and demonstrating proper techniques. This meant that throughout the day, he worked in close proximity to moving machinery that required constant vigilance to operate safely. Numerous times over the previous 2 months, water had been delivered to the cotton gin building by the twins. The machinery's operation and Simmons's habits had been observed by them. They noticed that he was particularly careless around the main drive belt, a wide leather strap that transferred power from the external wheel system to the interior processing mechanisms. Approximately 6 feet above the floor, this belt ran through an opening in the wall, moving at considerable speed when the system was operational. During the afternoon shift change on June 14, the twins made their move. For 15 minutes, the machinery had been shut down to allow workers to rotate. Alone in the building was Simmons, conducting his routine inspection of the equipment before operations resumed. As expected, carrying water buckets, Sarah and Margaret entered, and therefore invisible. What happened next took seconds. Concealed in the bottom of her water bucket, covered by the water itself, Sarah had a length of thin but strong rope. As Margaret engaged Simmons in conversation, a rare event that captured his full attention because the silent twins never spoke without direct prompting, Sarah moved to the area near the main drive belt. To a support beam near the belt opening, she secured one end of the rope, allowing the other end to dangle loosely near where Simmons stood. Unremarkable was the rope itself, standard plantation rope used for hundreds of purposes, but deliberate was its placement. When the machinery resumed operation and the drive belt began moving, the loose end of the rope would be caught by the belt's motion and rapidly wound up. Toward the moving machinery, anything connected to that rope would be pulled violently. About proper cotton feeding techniques, Margaret asked Simmons, keeping his attention focused away from where Sarah worked. Intelligent enough to require a detailed answer was her question, which was provided by Simmons while demonstrating with hand gestures. As he spoke, Sarah completed her preparation and rejoined her sister. With their water buckets, the twins departed the building, leaving Simmons alone with the rope system they had created. 17 minutes later, the afternoon shift began. Their positions were resumed by workers, and the external wheel system was engaged. With its characteristic creaking and grinding sounds, the machinery came to life. At approximately 8 feet per second, the main drive belt began to move. Near the belt opening, examining cotton samples, Harold Simmons was standing when the loose rope was caught by the belt's motion. Tight snapped the rope, and under the sudden tension, cracked the wooden beam to which it was secured. Part of the beam broke free and was pulled by the rope toward the belt opening, and directly in its path was standing Simmons. With tremendous force, the impact driven by the machinery's mechanical advantage, the beam section struck Simmons in the side of the head. Into the operating equipment, he fell. Immediately, the machinery was shut down by workers, but already dead was Harold Simmons, his neck broken by the initial impact with the beam. That a rope had somehow become entangled in the machinery, causing a structural failure that resulted in Simmons's accidental death, was concluded by the investigation. While uncommon, such accidents were not unprecedented in cotton processing facilities. No inherent defects were deemed to exist in the equipment. As an industrial accident, the incident was recorded, and 3 days later, Harold Simmons was buried. While serving dinner in the main house that evening, Sarah and Margaret learned of the death. With his wife, William Hutchkins was discussing the incident, expressing frustration about losing another experienced supervisor within such a short period. 3 men in less than 3 months, he said, shaking his head. Bad luck seems to follow this place lately. Appropriate concern was shown on the identical faces of the twins as they cleared plates and poured water. That night, in the darkness of their sleeping quarters, 14 more, was whispered by Margaret to her sister. Nothing was said by Sarah, but in the dim moonlight, her expression suggested agreement. Oppressive heat to Burke County was brought by the summer of 1851, the kind that made cotton fields shimmer in the distance and turned every physical task into an endurance test. Despite the recent deaths, production continued at Hutchkins Fields, though William Hutchkins noticed that finding qualified overseers had become more difficult. About the unusual string of accidents at his plantation, word had spread through the county, and experienced men were increasingly reluctant to accept positions there. By August, though with less experienced personnel than he preferred, Hutchkins had managed to fill the vacant positions. The new overseers included a man named George Whitfield who took over the cotton gin operation and Charles Drummond who supervised the field crews. Both men were younger than their predecessors, both eager to prove themselves, and both would be dead before the year ended. Beyond the boundaries of Hutchkins Fields, the twins had expanded their area of observation. On Sundays, when some of the enslaved population was permitted to attend religious services in Westboro, Sarah and Margaret accompanied Martha Crane to the Baptist church. During these trips, they observed the broader community of Burke County, noting the relationships between plantation owners, the movements of local officials, and the patterns of life in the small town. They discovered that Hutchkins Fields was not isolated. Regularly between plantations moved overseers and supervisors, sharing information and occasionally transferring to other properties. This created opportunities. A man who earned a place on the twins' list while working at Hutchkins Fields might later be accessible at a different location. Beyond the boundaries of their immediate environment began to think Sarah and Margaret, but they also became more cautious. Conversation had been generated by 3 deaths in 4 months, and while no one suspected murder, attention had been drawn by the unusual frequency of accidents. That continued activity at Hutchkins Fields would eventually create suspicion was understood by the twins. Their methods, their timing, and potentially their locations needed to be varied by them. On September 3, 1851, died George Whitfield. The result of cotton dust inhalation, a known hazard in processing facilities, appeared to be his death. That Sarah had deliberately loosened a joint in the ventilation system, concentrating dust in the area where Whitfield worked, was not discovered by anyone. Over several weeks, the accumulation had created conditions that, combined with Whitfield's existing respiratory sensitivity, proved fatal. Natural causes, attributed to the occupational hazards of cotton processing, was ruled as the death. Until November lasted Charles Drummond. During a routine inspection of field equipment occurred his death, when a wagon loaded with cotton bales shifted unexpectedly, crushing him against a storage building wall. That the wagon's brake system had failed was revealed by investigation. That Margaret had carefully weakened the brake mechanism over the course of 2 weeks, creating a delayed failure that appeared entirely mechanical, was not discovered by anyone. On November 24, 1851, in his study stood William Hutchkins, staring at his ledger entries. In 8 months, 5 overseers and supervisors dead. Statistically improbable, but not impossible. A reasonable explanation was had by each death. Accidental death had been concluded by each investigation, and yet something about the pattern troubled him. During their weekly planning meeting, his concerns were mentioned to Robert Crane by him. 5 men, Robert, in 8 months. Have you ever seen anything like it? Not, admitted Crane. But he also pointed out that each incident had been thoroughly investigated by Sheriff Morgan from Westboro, and each time the conclusion had been the same: tragic accident. Sometimes bad luck concentrates in one place for a while, Crane suggested, then it passes. What neither man considered was that the bad luck was being meticulously planned by 2 12-year-old girls who moved through their daily routines with perfect obedience while studying their next targets with predatory focus. From their first 5 eliminations, valuable lessons had been learned by the twins. They understood the importance of patience, of allowing time to pass between incidents. They recognized the need for variety in methods. Too many similar accidents would eventually raise questions. They had discovered that complex plans requiring multiple steps were more difficult to trace than simple direct actions. And they had realized that appearing helpful and concerned after each death made them even more invisible to investigation. By December 1851, 11 months had been spent by Sarah and Margaret at Hutchkins Fields. 5 men had been killed by them. On their original list, 14 names remained, and based on observations during the summer and fall, 3 more names had been added by them. With the same efficiency and obedience that had characterized their first months at the plantation, they worked. Only when necessary did they speak. No mistakes were made by them. Perfectly invisible they remained, but they were also watching developments beyond Hutchkins Fields. During Sunday trips to Westboro, they had observed that other plantations in Burke County employed overseers and supervisors who used similar methods of control and discipline. Throughout the county, throughout Georgia, throughout the entire South existed the system that created men like Vernon Cushing and Harold Simmons. Much longer could be their list. In January of 1852, 13 years old turned the twins. Though no one at Hutchkins Fields knew their exact birth date or thought to celebrate it, they marked the occasion privately in the darkness of their quarters by reviewing their progress and planning their next moves. 17 names remained on their list. Before suspicion became unavoidable, they estimated they could eliminate 3 more at Hutchkins Fields. After that, their approach would need to be adapted by them. An unexpected effect among the enslaved population had been created by the death toll at Hutchkins Fields. While no one openly celebrated the deaths of overseers, a noticeable decrease in the most brutal forms of punishment existed. Aware of their colleagues' fates and unnerved by the pattern of accidents, the remaining supervisors became more cautious in their actions. Out of genuine superstition, some moderated their behavior. Perhaps the plantation really was cursed. Others simply recognized that harsh discipline wasn't worth risking the bad luck that seemed to follow those who wielded it most enthusiastically. With satisfaction, these changes were observed by Sarah and Margaret. Beyond the immediate elimination of specific individuals, effects were being had by their campaign. An environment where fear ran in multiple directions was being created by them. On February 18, 1852, occurred the 6th death. Arnold Fletcher was the victim, 39 years old, known for his use of a leather strap to maintain work pace in the cotton fields. A simple drowning appeared to be Fletcher's death. On horseback during a winter rainstorm, he had been crossing a swollen creek when his horse lost footing, and both rider and animal were swept downstream. 2 miles from the crossing point was recovered Fletcher's body. The horse survived. That the twins had observed Fletcher's routine crossings for 3 weeks, noting that he always used the same ford location and always crossed during his afternoon inspection rounds, was not discovered by investigators. On the morning of February 18, knowing that heavy rain was forecast, the twins had visited the creek and used a wooden pole to deepen the underwater depression at Fletcher's usual crossing point. Quickly they worked, creating a hole approximately 3 feet deeper than the surrounding creek bed. During the storm-swollen crossing, when Fletcher's horse stepped into this depression, the sudden change in depth caused the animal to panic and lose footing. In a creek he had crossed hundreds of times before, Fletcher drowned. Accidental, another casualty of Georgia's unpredictable winter weather, was ruled as his death. 3 months later in May of 1852 followed the 7th death. James Pritchard, younger brother of Douglas Pritchard, who had died in April 1851, had taken a position at Hutchkins Field specifically to investigate his brother's death. The official explanation of equipment failure was not believed by him. Something more deliberate was occurring at the plantation was suspected by him. 2 months studying the plantation's operations, interviewing workers, and examining the sites of previous accidents were spent by James Pritchard. Methodical and intelligent was he, and patterns that troubled him were beginning to be identified by him. He noticed, for example, that several of the deaths had occurred in locations that the twin girls had regular access to. He observed that Sarah and Margaret seemed to be present in the vicinity of accidents with unusual frequency. But before Pritchard could formalize his suspicions or present them to William Hutchkins, in a stable fire died he. Just after midnight on May 9, 1852, started the blaze, apparently from a lantern that had been left burning in the tack room. In quarters adjacent to the stable had been sleeping Pritchard. Before the fire could be controlled, of smoke inhalation died he. The stable and most of its contents were destroyed. That the twins had started the fire deliberately using a careful arrangement of oil-soaked rags and slow-burning materials that would ignite hours after they left the area was not discovered by anyone. They had learned that Pritchard was asking questions, and they had eliminated him before those questions could become dangerous. But a turning point was marked by James Pritchard's death. Though incomplete, his investigation had identified genuine patterns. More importantly, in letters to his wife in South Carolina, he had documented his concerns, expressing his belief that something criminal was occurring at Hutchkins Fields. After his death, these letters reached William Hutchkins through Pritchard's widow, who demanded answers about her husband's demise. For the first time, serious questions were being asked. And for the first time, recognized by Sarah and Margaret that their activities at Hutchkins Fields had reached a natural conclusion. 16 months had been spent by them at the plantation. 7 men had been killed by them. Their remaining targets would have to wait or would have to be pursued elsewhere. Their departure began to be planned by the twins. On May 24, 1852, at Hutchkins Fields arrived Sheriff Clayton Morgan, carrying the letters written by James Pritchard before his death. 53 years old was Morgan, a Burke County native who had served as sheriff for 12 years. As a fair but practical man was he known, someone who understood that plantation life operated under rules different from those governing life in Westboro proper. But enough to warrant a personal visit and detailed questioning troubled him the letters. In his study, William Hutchkins received the sheriff, offering whiskey and cigars while maintaining a composed exterior that masked genuine concern. 7 deaths in 14 months, written accusations from a deceased overseer, significant was the potential for scandal. With careful precision, Morgan laid out the contents of Pritchard's letters. The dates and circumstances of each death at Hutchkins Fields had been documented by the deceased overseer. Patterns in the timing and locations of accidents had been noted by him. That many of the victims were known for particularly harsh discipline had been observed by him. And in his final letter dated 3 days before his death, he had mentioned that he suspected deliberate agency in these misfortunes, though I cannot yet identify the agent. Did Pritchard share these concerns with you? Morgan asked Hutchkins. He mentioned he was troubled by the coincidence of so many accidents, Hutchkins acknowledged. But he never suggested anything criminal. And certainly never accused any specific individual. Her husband was murdered, believes his widow, Morgan said bluntly. She's demanding a full investigation. What followed was the most thorough examination ever conducted at Hutchkins Fields. 3 days at the plantation were spent by Sheriff Morgan interviewing overseers, supervisors, and selected members of the enslaved population. The sites of previous accidents were examined by him. Equipment and structures were reviewed by him. Testimony and documentation were compiled by him. Along with dozens of others, Sarah and Margaret were interviewed. In the presence of Martha Crane, Morgan spoke to them, asking routine questions about their duties and whether they had witnessed anything unusual. With appropriate deference, the twins responded, describing their daily routines and admitting they had been present near several of the accident sites, but then they were frequently moving around the plantation in the course of their kitchen duties, so this seemed unremarkable. Their presence near multiple incidents was noted by Morgan, but nothing inherently suspicious in it was seen by him. 12-year-old girls, recently turned 13, small for their age, always together, always obedient were they. Absurd on its surface seemed the idea that they could have engineered the deaths of 7 adult men. After 3 days of investigation, concluded by Sheriff Morgan that while the pattern of deaths was unusual and troubling, no evidence existed to suggest criminal activity. Plausible explanations were had by each incident. Accident or misfortune could be attributed to each. The result of grief over his brother's death rather than based in factual evidence appeared to be James Pritchard's suspicions, while understandable. Sometimes, Morgan told William Hutchkins before departing, bad luck concentrates in one place for a period of time, then it passes. I suspect your troubles are behind you now. But one recommendation was added by Morgan, consider rotating your supervisory staff. Bring in new people, perhaps from other counties. Fresh eyes might break whatever pattern has been established here. This advice was taken by Hutchkins. Over the following weeks, significant changes to his overseer structure were made by him. As head overseer remained Robert Crane, his competence and long service made him irreplaceable, but most of the other supervisory positions were filled with men from outside Burke County. Different methods and different routines were brought by these new employees, disrupting the patterns that Sarah and Margaret had studied so carefully. Immediately, the implications were recognized by the twins. Obsolete had become their detailed knowledge of schedules, routes, and vulnerabilities. Months would be needed by them to learn the new patterns, and during that time, under increased scrutiny would they be. The investigation, even though it had exonerated everyone, had made the entire plantation more watchful. But also created by the changes was an opportunity the twins hadn't anticipated. Concerned about his plantation's reputation and eager to demonstrate normalcy, William Hutchkins began accepting invitations to social events throughout Burke County. Situations where Sarah and Margaret, when assigned to serve at such events, could observe targets from multiple plantations in a single location were created by these gatherings. On June 19, 1852, attended their first such event the twins, when Hutchkins hosted a dinner for neighboring plantation owners and their senior staff. At the main house gathered 23 people, and throughout the evening, food and drink were served by Sarah and Margaret. With their characteristic silence and efficiency, they moved through the dining room and parlor, becoming part of the background while collecting valuable information. Names and faces of overseers from plantations throughout Burke County were learned by them. Conversations about disciplinary methods, production techniques, and labor management were heard by them. Who drank too much, who became careless with their words, who held grudges against colleagues was observed by them. And they began to understand that their campaign didn't need to be limited to Hutchkins fields. Over the following months, additional opportunities were provided by similar social gatherings. At dinners, barbecues, and harvest celebrations served the twins. To church functions where plantation management families socialized, they accompanied Martha Crane. About the broader network of control and violence that characterized the region's plantation system, information was absorbed by them. By September 1852, mental dossiers on 17 individuals across 6 different plantations in Burke County had been compiled by Sarah and Margaret. Exhausted had been their original list. Either died, left the area, or modified their behavior sufficiently to remove themselves from consideration had the remaining names. Fresh targets represented this new list, but accessing them presented challenges the twins had never faced before. Simply move between plantations at will could not they? Controlled and monitored were their movements. Assistance would be needed by them, or situations where their presence outside Hutchkins' field seemed natural and necessary would need to be created by them. From an unexpected source came the solution. In October 1852, an interest in organizing charitable activities for the moral improvement of the slave population throughout Burke County was developed by Elenina Hutchkins. Partly genuine religious conviction and partly an attempt to rehabilitate the Hutchkins family reputation after the troubling events of the previous year was this philanthropic impulse. To assess needs and organize distribution of basic goods, additional blankets for winter, basic medical supplies, religious texts, Elenina began visiting other plantations. With her on these visits were brought Sarah and Margaret, using them to carry supplies and assist with distribution. As obedient and efficient servants made them ideal assistants for such work was the twins' reputation. Access to other plantations, opportunities to observe operations and routines, and chances to identify vulnerabilities in new locations were provided by these visits to Sarah and Margaret. Between October 1852 and March 1853, on 17 such visits to 5 different Burke County plantations accompanied they Elenina Hutchkins. During this period, 3 overseers from other plantations died in apparent accidents. From a horse fell one and broke his neck. By a collapsed equipment shed was crushed another. In an irrigation pond under circumstances that seemed perfectly explicable drowned a third. He had been drinking, had gone swimming alone at night, and had apparently suffered a cramp or heart failure. Routinely, each death was investigated by Sheriff Morgan, but nothing suspicious was found by him. At different plantations occurred the incidents, involved different circumstances, and showed no connecting patterns beyond the general fact that plantation work was dangerous and accidents happened regularly. That Sarah and Margaret had been present near each accident site within days before each death occurred, visiting as part of Elenina Hutchkins's charitable activities, was not known by Morgan. During these visits, the victims had been studied by them, vulnerabilities identified, and with the same precise planning that had characterized their earlier work, acted. But new risks were created by the expanded geography of their campaign. In a familiar environment where they knew every building and path were no longer operating the twins. In locations they could visit only occasionally were they working, relying on quick assessments and rapidly executed plans. Even more careful planning was required by this and left less margin for error. On April 3, 1853, for the first time, something went wrong. An overseer named Richard Blackwell at a plantation called Fairview, approximately 8 miles from Hutchins Fields, had been targeted by the twins. Throughout Burke County was known Blackwell for extreme cruelty, and to plantation owners who either ignored the reports or considered such methods necessary had been reported as brutality by multiple witnesses. Twice with Elenina Hutchins had visited Fairview the twins. During these visits, they had observed that Blackwell maintained a small office in a building separate from the main house, where he kept records and stored personal items. Isolated was the building, surrounded by trees, and alone in the early morning hours often worked there Blackwell. A fire similar to the one that killed James Pritchard, a delayed ignition that would appear accidental and give them time to establish alibis, had been planned to be created by Sarah and Margaret. Materials had been prepared and hidden near Blackwell's office building during their second visit to Fairview. But on the night of April 3rd, when they attempted to implement their plan, discovered they that Blackwell had changed his routine. In the office building rather than in his usual quarters had he begun sleeping. Immediately woke he when the fire started and escaped before the flames could trap him. Completely burned the building, but with only minor burns and smoke inhalation survived Blackwell. More importantly, 2 figures running from the area just as he exited the burning building were reported seen by Blackwell. Clearly in the darkness and smoke couldn't be identified they by him, but as small and moving together, like they were joined, were described they by him. Within hours, this description reached Sheriff Morgan. For the first time since his investigation of James Pritchard's letters, the possibility that something beyond ordinary accidents might be occurring began to be seriously considered by Morgan. 2 figures, small, moving together, many people could fit the description, but it also fit the twin girls from Hutchins Fields, who with Elenina Hutchins had visited Fairview just 3 days before the fire. His suspicions with anyone didn't immediately share Morgan. More than a vague description in poor visibility was needed by him, but closer attention to reports of accidents throughout Burke County began to be paid by him, and questions about who had been present near accident sites in the days and hours before incidents occurred began to be asked by him. That their situation had changed was recognized by Sarah and Margaret. Their first significant error had been made by them, and while it hadn't directly exposed them, questions where none had existed before had been created by it. Even more careful would need to become they, or leaving Burke County entirely would need to be considered by them. An escape began to be planned by the twins. The twins' 27th month at Hutchins Fields was marked by the spring of 1853. 10 men across multiple plantations in Burke County had been killed by them. A thorough investigation by Sheriff Morgan had been survived by them. Their methods to changing circumstances had been adapted by them and their operations beyond their original location had been expanded by them. But also made had they their first mistake, and that mistakes would accumulate and eventually become fatal was understood by them. A particularly brilliant investigator was not Sheriff Morgan, but methodical and patient was he. After the fire at Fairview and Richard Blackwell's description of the 2 figures, systematically reviewing every accident report from the previous 2 years began Morgan. A timeline of deaths and incidents was created by him, noting dates, locations, and circumstances. And patterns that he hadn't recognized before began to be seen by him. Near many of these incidents appeared the twin girls from Hutchins Fields. Not all of them, but enough to be statistically unusual. At social gatherings where victims were present had they been serving. On charitable visits to plantations where accidents later occurred had they accompanied Elenina Hutchins. During his investigation of deaths at Hutchins Fields itself had they been interviewed. Circumstantial was the evidence and would never support criminal prosecution. But his instincts developed over 12 years as Sheriff told him something was wrong. On May 15, 1853, again visited he Hutchins Fields and requested a private conversation with William Hutchins. About your twin girls, I have concerns, Morgan began carefully. Sarah and Margaret, I believe they may have information about the accidents that have occurred throughout the county. Dismissive was Hutchins's initial response. Sheriff, they're 13-year-old girls. What possible information could they have? With methodical precision, his timeline and observations were laid out by Morgan, the pattern of the twins' presence near accident sites, the description from Richard Blackwell, the unusual frequency of deaths among overseers known for harsh discipline, the fact that James Pritchard had mentioned suspecting deliberate agency just before his death in a fire, And now another fire at Fairview, potentially set by two small figures moving together. Not saying they're responsible, am I? Morgan emphasized. Saying they may have witnessed something, seen something, heard something, am I? More freely than most enslaved workers move they around because of their duties. Information they don't even realize is significant might be had by them. More thoroughly to question the twins, agreed Hutchkins, to allow Morgan, but present during any interrogation, insisted he on being. Also contacted he his attorney, a man named Samuel Thornton from Augusta, to provide legal counsel. Even discussing the possibility that enslaved individuals might have committed crimes against white overseers required careful legal navigation in 1853 Georgia. For May 22 was scheduled the interrogation. A week to prepare was had by Sarah and Margaret, and that time to refine their story and evaluate their options was used by them. That Sheriff Morgan suspected them, even if he couldn't prove anything, was understood by them. Also understood was by them that sustained scrutiny would eventually reveal inconsistencies, no matter how carefully their innocent facade was maintained by them. On May 20th, 2 days before the scheduled interrogation, their decision was made by Sarah and Margaret. To be questioned would not wait they. On Morgan's inability to prove his suspicions would not gamble they. Immediately that very night would leave they Hutchkins Fields. For months, escape routes had been planned by the twins, studying the geography of Burke County and the patterns of slave patrols. Which roads were monitored most heavily and which paths through the forests offered better concealment was known by them. Supplies had been hidden by them, stolen food, basic tools, warm clothing, in locations between Hutchkins Fields and the Savannah River, which formed the boundary between Georgia and South Carolina, approximately 40 miles to the east. Straightforward was their plan: travel at night, hide during daylight, reach the river within a week, and cross into South Carolina, where different laws and different officials might offer slightly better odds of avoiding capture. A desperate plan with poor chances of success was it, but better than waiting for Morgan's investigation to trap them was it. On the night of May 20, 1853, after the evening meal service ended and the plantation settled into darkness, for the last time slipped from the kitchen quarters Sarah and Margaret. Nothing that would seem unusual if they were stopped was carried by them, just a basket with kitchen linens that needed washing at the creek, a common task that justified their movement around the plantation after dark. Less than a mile from Hutchkins Fields had been traveled by them when on the path encountered they someone. From an evening visit to one of the outlying storage buildings was returning Robert Crane. Alone was he, carrying a lantern, and immediately recognized he the twins. "Sarah, Margaret, what are you doing out here at this hour?" froze the twins. For many contingencies had been planned by them, but not for a direct confrontation with the head overseer in an isolated location. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. Flickering shadows across Crane's weathered face were cast by the lantern light, and from surprise to suspicion shifted his expression as he noticed the twins' body language, tense, coiled, ready to run. "Running are you?" Crane said, his voice quiet but certain. "Trying to escape are you?" "Nothing," said Sarah and Margaret. Simply stared they at Crane with identical expressions that held no fear, no pleading, no emotion at all. And in that moment, something in their eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward was seen by Crane. With enslaved populations for over 20 years had worked he. Fear, hatred, desperation, resignation, and every other emotion that bondage produced had been seen by him, but never had he seen the cold calculation that looked back at him from the faces of these 13-year-old girls. In that moment, standing alone on a dark path with only his lantern for light, with absolute certainty understood Robert Crane that Sheriff Morgan's suspicions were correct. "You it was," he whispered. "All those deaths. Vernon Cushing, Douglas Pritchard, all of them. 2 children. How is that possible?" Finally spoke Sarah, her voice soft but clear in the night air. "Not children are we, Mr. Crane. Never were we." Toward the knife on his belt moved Crane's hand, a defensive gesture born of sudden fear rather than aggressive intent. But faster moved Margaret. A heavy stone behind her back had been held by her, picked up from the path while Crane's attention was focused on her sister. With precise force, the stone struck Crane's lantern hand, causing him to drop the light. The ground hit the lantern and shattered, plunging the area into darkness, broken only by scattered flames from the spilled oil. In shadows and confusion occurred what happened next. With coordinated precision moved the twins, their eyes already adjusted to darkness. Strong and experienced was Crane, but also surprised was he, off balance from the blow to his hand and fighting opponents whose methods he didn't understand. Less than a minute lasted the struggle. When it ended, unconscious on the path lay Robert Crane, blood seeping from a head wound where against a rock had he fallen during the fight. Through the dry grass and undergrowth beside the path were spreading the scattered flames from his dropped lantern. Within minutes, visible from the plantation buildings would be the fire. A choice was faced by Sarah and Margaret. Immediately could flee they, taking advantage of the confusion that the fire would create, or could ensure they that Robert Crane, the only person who could testify to their guilt, would never speak about what he had discovered. In the growing firelight looked at each other the twins, communicating through that mysterious connection that had existed between them since birth. Then their decision was made by them. The unconscious Crane was lifted and carried by them closer to the spreading fire, positioning his body where within minutes would reach him the flames. That the head overseer had suffered an accident with his lantern, been rendered unconscious by the fall, and been unable to escape the resulting fire would appear. Quickly worked they, arranging the scene to suggest accident rather than violence. Then into the darkness fled they, moving east toward the Savannah River and whatever possibility of freedom lay beyond it. Behind them, into the night sky climbed flames. Within an hour, Robert Crane's burned body would be discovered by workers from Hutchkins Fields and begin fighting the fire that threatened to spread to nearby buildings. By dawn, over his head overseer's remains would be standing William Hutchkins, and summoned to investigate the 11th death in 26 months would be Sheriff Morgan. And gone would be Sarah and Margaret, vanished into the forests and swamps of eastern Georgia, leaving behind nothing but questions and a trail of carefully orchestrated deaths that would remain unexplained for decades. With renewed urgency brought Sheriff Morgan back to Hutchkins Fields the discovery of Robert Crane's body at dawn on May 21, 1853. Consistent with accident appeared the scene, a dropped lantern, a fall, unconsciousness from head trauma, death by fire and smoke inhalation. But in coincidental accidents at this plantation no longer believed Morgan. When reported Martha Crane that Sarah and Margaret had not returned to their quarters the previous night and could not be located anywhere on the plantation, into certainty crystallized Morgan's suspicions. Immediately organized he a search party and dispatched messages to neighboring plantations and the slave patrol system that monitored roads and paths throughout Burke County. But a 12-hour head start was had by the twins, and well used that advantage was by them. Through areas studied during their months at Hutchkins Fields traveled they, following paths that avoided the most heavily monitored roads. With the efficiency born of careful planning moved they, pausing only briefly during daylight hours before resuming their eastward journey. By the evening of May 21, approximately 18 miles from Hutchkins Fields had been traveled by Sarah and Margaret. Exhausted were they, hungry despite their hidden supplies, and increasingly aware that sustained pursuit would eventually overtake them. Better than simply running was a better plan needed by them. That night, hiding in a small cave formation along a creek, a conversation that revealed the depth of their strategic thinking was had by the twins. For continuing east toward the Savannah River into South Carolina, argued Margaret. Disagreed Sarah, suggesting instead that north toward Augusta move they, where the larger population and active river commerce might offer better opportunities for concealment. To run for South Carolina will expect us they, reasoned Sarah. That's what runaways always do. But enough activity has Augusta that two more faces might not be noticed. On the docks or with a merchant could find we work. For free could pass we if careful are we. This considered Margaret. Two distinctive look we. Identical twins are remembered. Then separate we, quietly said Sarah. Always together have we been. That's what makes us memorable. Alone, just two girls among hundreds. Clearly pained both of them did this suggestion, but its logic was recognized by them. Together, instantly identifiable were they. Separated, less remarkable became each, less likely to trigger recognition. After several minutes of silent consideration, to the plan agreed Margaret. Until reaching Augusta, stay together decided they, then to separate and independently establish new identities. for at least 1 year, not attempt to contact each other would they, reducing the risk that tracking one twin would lead to the other. If survived that year both they, on a specific date at a specific location chosen that night would attempt to reunite they. For the next 3 days, north toward Augusta traveled Sarah and Margaret, covering approximately 35 miles through a combination of forest paths and careful use of public roads during periods when traffic was heavy enough to provide concealment. Through 2 small communities passed they without incident, successfully presenting themselves as enslaved workers on errands for their owners when questioned by curious observers. On May 24th, the outskirts of Augusta reached they, a bustling river city of nearly 8,000 residents. On cotton trade centered Augusta's economy, with dozens of warehouses, merchant offices, and processing facilities lining the Savannah River waterfront. Free black residents included the city's population, a detail that had been learned by the twins during their months of observation and eavesdropping at Hutchkins Fields. On the afternoon of May 24, 1853, in a wooded area south of Augusta's main commercial district, separated Sarah and Margaret. Briefly embraced they, the first and last display of emotion either had shown since beginning their campaign at Hutchkins Fields. Then north toward the city's warehouse district turned Sarah, and west toward the residential areas where free black families lived and worked headed Margaret. Back looked neither twin. For 13 years together had survived they through circumstances neither had ever described to anyone, and together with cold precision had killed they. But now separation required survival, and this necessity as they had accepted everything else was accepted by them, with clear-eyed pragmatism and no wasted emotion. A matter of speculation and rumor throughout Burke County became what happened to Sarah and Margaret after that separation. As far as the outskirts of Augusta tracked their movements Sheriff Morgan, but in the city's complex geography and transient population lost the trail. Merchants, dock workers, and free black community leaders were interviewed by him, but no one reported seeing 2 identical 13-year-old girls together. Of single young girls matching the twins' general description surfaced several reports, one supposedly working at a tobacco warehouse under an assumed name, another reportedly taken in by a free black family as a servant. But either sighting could never confirm Morgan. As completely as if they had never existed had vanished the twins. Back in Burke County, for several months continued the investigation into the deaths at Hutchkins Fields and surrounding plantations. Devastated by the loss of Robert Crane and the revelation that his plantation had harbored murderers, William Hutchkins cooperated fully with Sheriff Morgan's inquiries. A nervous collapse suffered Elenina Hutchkins and to her bed for 6 weeks was confined. In Morgan's official report filed with the county court on August 15, 1853, were summarized the investigation's findings. 11 deaths across 4 plantations between March 1851 and May 1853 were documented by the report. The unusual circumstances of each death and the pattern of the twins' presence near accident sites were noted. That strong circumstantial evidence exists to suggest that the enslaved females Sarah and Margaret, property of William Hutchkins, were responsible for deliberately causing the deaths of multiple overseers and supervisors through methods calculated to appear accidental was concluded. Also noted was the report that the twins had escaped custody before formal charges could be filed, and their current whereabouts were unknown. For information leading to their capture were posted rewards, but no credible sightings were ever reported. A source of whispered conversation throughout Burke County for years afterward became the story of the twin girls who killed 11 men and disappeared. That 2 13-year-old girls could have accomplished such things refused to believe some people. Accepted the evidence others, but struggled to understand the psychology that would drive children to such calculated violence. A darker conclusion eventually came to a few observers, including Sheriff Morgan himself. In a private letter to a colleague in South Carolina, written in 1855, expressed Morgan his belief that those girls were formed by something that happened before they arrived in Burke County. Whatever made them into what they became, it occurred earlier in their lives. Only the result saw we, not the cause. And perhaps that's for the best, because not certain am I that no want I what experiences could shape children into such perfect instruments of death. Sparse and largely uninformative were the records of Sarah and Margaret's origins. At an estate auction in Augusta in December 1850 had purchased them the trader who sold them to William Hutchkins. Only as domestic servants, trained twin females were listed them by the estate's records. No previous ownership documentation existed, or if it did, lost or destroyed had it been. About their past never had spoken the twins themselves, and now gone were they, carrying their secrets with them into whatever future they had managed to create in the anonymous spaces of the American South in 1853. After May 1853 stopped the deaths. No more suspicious accidents befell overseers in Burke County. No more convenient fires claimed the lives of supervisors known for cruelty. Simply ceased the pattern that had characterized 26 months of careful murder, leaving only questions and speculation in its wake. In 1854 sold his plantation William Hutchkins, and to Charleston, South Carolina moved he. From the revelation that 2 children he had owned had systematically murdered his employees never fully recovered he. In 1856 died Elenina Hutchkins, her death certificate listing the cause as nervous exhaustion and melancholia. As Burke County Sheriff until 1862 served Sheriff Morgan, when the outbreak of the Civil War disrupted all civilian law enforcement. For information about Sarah and Margaret never stopped looking he, maintaining correspondence with law enforcement officials throughout Georgia and South Carolina. No credible reports of the twins ever reached him. In 1867, 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, an anonymous letter postmarked from Philadelphia was received by Morgan. Only a few lines contained the letter: "Survived we. New lives built we. Again killed never we after leaving Georgia. What did we there was necessary. Evil were not we. Justice were we." And signed was the letter, but until his death believed Morgan that from one of the twins came it. Whether accurate was that belief remains unknown. No existing samples match the handwriting because as literate during their time at Hutchkins Fields had never been documented the twins, but then much about Sarah and Margaret remained unknown, including how the skills that made them such effective killers had been learned by them. Beyond the immediate deaths they caused extended the broader impact of their campaign. Throughout Burke County and into neighboring regions, noticeably more cautious in their disciplinary methods became overseers and supervisors during the mid-1850s. That seemingly helpless individuals might possess hidden power, that violence might be returned by those assumed to be incapable of resistance, created changes in behavior that lasted for years was the fear. New oversight structures installed some plantation owners, implementing systems wherein pairs rather than alone were required to work overseers. The most extreme forms of punishment moderated others, recognizing that excessive cruelty might provoke the kind of calculated revenge that possible had been demonstrated by Sarah and Margaret. Examining the period have noted historians that Burke County experienced a measurable decrease in documented instances of severe physical punishment during the 5 years following the twins' escape. Whether directly attributable to their actions or to other factors remains this debatable, but in the historical record exists the correlation. One of the many mysteries surrounding their story remains the ultimate fate of Sarah and Margaret. The chaos of the Civil War years did survive they. Successfully under assumed identities establish independent lives did they. As they had planned on that night in May 1853, ever reunite did they? No definitive answers exist, but occasionally in documents from the post-war period, intriguing possibilities have been identified by researchers. In Philadelphia city directories from 1868 onward appears a woman named Sarah Hutchinson, listed as a seamstress. In Boston census records from 1870 is recorded a Margaret Hutchinson, described as a domestic worker. Whether using slightly modified versions of their former owner's surname were these the twins or simply coincidental name similarities cannot be determined from available evidence. With certainty can be stated that 2 13-year-old girls, enslaved and powerless by every legal and social standard of their time, managed to kill 11 adult men, evade investigation by law enforcement, and escape into freedom. Through intelligence, planning, patience, and a complete absence of the mercy that their victims had never shown to others was this accomplished by them. Uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the nature of evil are asked by their story. Murderers who deserved punishment were Sarah and Margaret, or resistance fighters who struck back against a system built on violence and oppression were they? On perspective partly depends the answer and partly on how the value of lives in a society where some humans were legally classified as property is weighed. A nuanced view was suggested by Sheriff Morgan's final written thoughts on the case, recorded in his personal journal in 1869, "Murder committed those girls. That is fact. But murderers murdered they. Men who violence wielded as casually as others wield tools. In a more just world, legal consequences for their cruelty would have faced those men. But just was not our world, and so consequences became those girls. History judged them will, as all of us judges it by standards recognize or accept may not we. Only say can I that for 4 years chased them I and never caught them. And some part of me wonders if truly wanted to I. In the Burke County Courthouse archives remains the documentation of this case, available to researchers who know where to look. At the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah in climate-controlled storage sit the leather-bound ledgers from Hutchins Fields, meticulously recording births, deaths, and property transactions. On microfilm have been preserved the newspaper accounts from 1853 describing the mysterious series of accidents and the escaped slave twins suspected of causing them. But the most important evidence, the testimony of Sarah and Margaret themselves, the full story of what formed them into who they became, was never recorded and is now lost to history. Only from the aftermath they left behind can be reconstructed their actions, like archaeologists examining ancient ruins and trying to understand the civilization that built them. This is what know we, for 26 months in the early 1850s, 2 enslaved children with no legal rights, no social power, and no access to weapons or resources successfully waged a campaign of strategic elimination against multiple adult men who held absolute authority over them. With such precision did they do so that accidental appeared each death until from accumulated incidents emerged patterns. Without being caught killed they, without being tracked escaped they, and into the vast anonymity of pre-Civil War America disappeared they. Part of American history is their story, uncomfortable as that recognition might be. In the archives alongside the sanitized narratives and the heroic myth sits it, a reminder that darker truths that resist simple moral categorization contains history. From that past stare back at us the 2 identical faces that watched their victims die with eyes holding no fear, no guilt, and no mercy, asking questions about justice and revenge that remain unanswered. Think what do you about this story? Really accomplish what allegedly did Sarah and Margaret could 2 13-year-old girls? Or somewhere else entirely lies the truth, in explanations considered haven't we? For doubt leaves room the historical record, but also for the possibility that sometimes ways find the powerless to strike back against power with devastating effectiveness leaves it room. Below in the comments share your thoughts. And if fascinated you this story, for more explorations of America's darkest historical mysteries subscribe to our channel. Until next time, remember that rarely as simple as we'd like it to be is history.